We're glad to have you with us on Facebook Live for our Sunday evening get-together on this virtual way of meeting together. During these times, this is wonderful. We can meet this way, and we're looking at the book of James on Sunday evenings at Randolph Church of Christ. By way of review, we went through chapter 1, and we found out that this book of James is a handbook on what Christian living is all about. It's about living by faith and not by sight. And some have called the book of James the New Testament book of Proverbs. In James chapter 1, he teaches us how to deal with temptation and what temptation is about. And we also learn from chapter 1 the difference in pure religion and vain religion. In chapter 2, he talks to us about prejudice. And he tells us how that we're not holding the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ if we have respect of persons in our hearts. He also talks to us in chapter 2 about the nature of faith. How that faith, if it is real, it's not mere words, but it's faith in action. And we can see that the faith that saves in the book of James is that faith which obeys. It complies with the will of God. In chapter 3 of James, he tells brethren or Christians that they need to be careful how they use their tongue. The tongue is a little member of our body, but it's like an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. And so we have to be careful how we use our tongue and the way that we use our words. In chapter 4, after having talked about the difference of wisdom in the end of chapter 3, there's a kind of wisdom from below that is earthly and sensual and demonic. In contrast with that, there's a wisdom from above, which is first pure, then peaceable, then gentle, and easy to be entreated, and without partiality and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. So chapter 3 ends with the word peace. Chapter 4 opens about talking about war. And where do wars and fightings come from? Well, he says that wars and fightings come from within. That is, from the evil desires that we have inside of us. And we covet and we kill and we become dissatisfied because we don't receive what we're looking for if we're going about life in these measures. They're awfully sinful to try to get what we would want doing that. And then he says you ask. And it's right to ask God for things, but he says you ask amiss, that you may consume these things upon your own lusts. In other words, spend the gain that you would receive on your own pleasures. And so we should not ask in prayer by asking amiss, ask for things not according to God's will. But if we have the right heart toward God, wanting his will to be done, and we ask for things in accordance with God's will, we can expect an answer. God may say yes to our request. He may say no. He may say wait a while. And that's what chapter 5 is about. Because in chapter 5, we Christians are going to have to wait from time to time, especially in times of difficulty, especially in times of anxiety and persecution. In chapter 4, he also mentions that we should not ever leave God out of our plans. I think it's becoming obvious to a lot of people now that they have forgotten God for far too long. Now, with things coming to a halt in our economy, with people not able to go to work, they see that they should have been depending on God all along. Perhaps now is the time for humility. And in fact, no doubt it is the time for humility, for people to realize that we really do depend upon God. It is truly in God that we live and move and have our very being. God holds our lives in his very hand. And when people forget God, they get into all manner of things. I was talking to my wife this morning and I said, look at all the people in our neighborhood. We hardly ever see them, but now they're at home. And it seems they have time to do things that they've not had time to do. And it's because this world has slowed down. We've been far too busy for far too long. And this slowdown, while it has some negative sides, it has some upsides too. And some of the little children who've hardly gotten to see their parents because their parents both work and are always tired are now at home with their children. And we're learning through this that we depend on God for things that maybe we didn't realize that I'm trying to say that we're taking for granted. We take for granted some things that we shouldn't take for granted. And he asked the question, what is your life? It's even as a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. For as you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. And so that's what chapter 4 is about. And he ends chapter 4 by saying, to him that knows to do good and does it not, to him it is sin. So there's the sin of omission. I mean, we talk about committing sin, but what if you leave undone things you ought to do? There's so many people ought to be attending the worship services of the church when we can meet together, and they forsake the assembly. Right now, people are at home not forsaking the assembly. They're not allowed to go to the assembly from the standpoint of contagion. And so we're not forsaking the assembly in that way. But we shouldn't ever take for granted in good times when we have the freedom to assemble, just to move that aside and pretend it's not important. If we know to do good and do it not, then we're sinning. And that applies in many areas of life. Well, chapter 5, James addresses the enemies of the Christians. He's mentioned them a couple of times, like in chapter 1, verse 11, James says this in the last part of that verse. He says, so the rich man will fade away in all his pursuits. And it seems that James is saying that rich people are bad, but that's not what James is saying. If you look at the context, when James mentions the rich, well, he's talking to poor Christians. And so people who have more money are going to be rich, but what they're facing are wicked rich people. Now, not all rich people are wicked, and not all poor people are righteous. There are some very good men and women who have a lot of money, and they do good things and great things with their money. Abraham had a lot of money. David had a lot of money. There were rich men in the Bible like Job who had a lot of money, lost it all, and then were able to regain twice as much at the Lord's blessing. So it's not a sin to have money, it's our attitude toward it, and it is the love of money that's the root of all evil. But rich men can be good, and poor people can be good. But rich men can be wicked, and poor people can be very corrupt. And so it really depends upon the heart of the person, not the amount of money or lack of money in one's bank account, as it were. And so the rich man will fade away in his ways. That's talking about the rich, wicked, oppressive man who was oppressing the Christians James was writing to. In James chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, again he addresses this. He says, you've dishonored the poor man, talking to the wicked rich. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? Think about it. Wealth is really in the eye of the beholder. There are those who would have $1 million who would think that they didn't have much compared to a billionaire, and $1 billion is 1,000 million. So a 1 millionaire compared to 1,000 millionaire, well, he doesn't have near as much money, and he might consider himself poor compared to the billionaire. Well, I don't think any of us have that problem, but it is a relative thing when you look at wealth, and there were rich Christians that were better off than others, and he makes this point. He says, you have dishonored the poor. And he says, think about it. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you before the judgment seats? Do not they blaspheme that worthy name by which you are called? So those who are relatively rich as Christians were dishonoring the poorer Christians, and he'll address that in chapter 2 about being prejudiced. But he says there are those far richer than you are who are oppressing you. So why are you acting in a dishonorable way? And so he's chastising them as he's also teaching them about the man who lives by faith. In chapter 3, again, he talks about the use of the tongue, and we're to be careful how we use our tongue. And in chapter 4, about the wars. And in chapter 5, he comes back to the rich. But this time, he's on the Christian side, and he's lashing out against the enemies of the Christians. The rich, he says, come now, you rich, in verse 1. And he's talking about the wicked rich. That is, those who would oppress the Christians and drag them before the judgment seats into court and rig the system where they could be mistreated by a corrupt system. So let's look at James chapter 5, and we will study for our purposes tonight verses 1 through 11, and we'll see how God treats the enemies of the Christians and how that they can have comfort in view of this. And I hope that we can make this point, that in troubled times, whether it be persecution from those who are wealthy in society, or if we have problems of any kind, it is the man or woman who lives by faith who will endure. If we put our faith anywhere outside of God, our faith is misplaced, and we're going to find that there's just more confusion. In fact, he says in another place in this book, where envy and strife is, there's confusion and every evil work. And so we have to put our faith in the right place so that there's clarity. And that's what he's giving us here. So now he's going against the rich who were oppressing those that James was writing to. He turns the focus to the wicked rich. He says, come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You've heaped up treasure together in the last days. It's pretty strong language. But what he's saying is that the wicked rich can expect sorrow. What he's saying is it's howling time for the rich. It's time to begin weeping. It's time to begin weeping and howling among the rich even before their destruction comes, because their misery is going to be so bad they might as well get on with the business of howling and weeping now. And that's what he says. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Now the Christians could take comfort in this, because at this moment they were being mistreated terribly. Now, who are these wicked rich? Well, we have to think about the time which this was written. The Christians, during the time that this was written, were facing persecution from Jews. And Jesus himself addressed these rich, wicked Jews in Matthew chapter 23 with some very pointed and strong language. In fact, he said, you are the people who devour widows' houses. Can you imagine that people were making themselves rich by taking the few things that widows had left to them? There may have been widows that had just a little bit of money, or maybe they had their house paid for after a lifetime of saving and building, and they were devouring widows' houses, perhaps ringing up credit and debt, ringing up debt to their credit, and then foreclosing on their houses, devouring widows' houses. How awful and how callous that is. And no wonder Jesus was so strong in his language toward these so-called religious people who would do such a thing. And it was these kind of rich people that could go ahead and begin their howling and their weeping because their misery